My name is John Kernaghan. My military rank varied. Went from private to specialist, back to private again. I was in the Army from January of 1970 until April of 1971. When we moved to Elmhurst, it was 1954. I was 4 years old. There was dirt roads. There was a brand new subdivision. A lot of the families in the area were all World War II vets with young kids. It was like $27,000 for the house. Later on, after I actually got out of the Army and I was working construction, building swimming pools, he had his last payment on the kitchen table. It was like $50, and I had just gotten paid, so I threw him a 50 and said, "Here, I'm paying off your house." Pretty normal growing up in Elmhurst. Went to York High School, where I met Randy. We don't actually recall how we met the first time. We just started hanging out somewhere. Went to college at Whitewater, Wisconsin Whitewater. Went up there because it was 18 to drink beer, and a lot of my friends were up there. Proceeded to flunk out, and that's how I got to be 1A and ended up in the Army.
Elmhurst, I always thought it's kind of like a little Mayberry. Even today, it's pretty average, especially, well, maybe it's because I live in Hollywood now, which is a freak show. What was the country like back then compared to how it is now?
You mean as far as the United States, like the political climate or whatever?
Well, how are we different culturally? And this is before Vietnam was even on the radar.
It's like, you go back to the 50s, like that TV show Mad Men. That was my father working in sales. As a perk for the job, you had a Playboy Key Club membership. It was just the 50s, typical growing up in the 50s, and then you get to the 60s and things start to change a little bit. Things started to get a little more political the longer I was in high school. I remember in high school getting suspended because I had sideburns to the bottom of my ear, and the dean drew me a picture of an ear with a line where my sideburns were supposed to be, and I had to carry that picture with me. And he stopped me one day and said, "Well, your sideburns are too long," and I had to actually go home and have my mother and father come back to school with me. And of course, my father was going crazy. And then, I think it was 3 years later, he had sideburns to the bottom of his ear, and he's walking around in a Nehru jacket and a gold chain. It was a time of big change in the 60s, especially.
Any of your family serve in the military?
My father was in World War II with Patton, is in the Battle of the Bulge. He was pretty young, too, when he was in, I'd say, early 20s. Spent 3 years in the Army in Europe.
Did he ever discuss what he went through over there?
Not much. I remember one time I was going through a box that I found in the attic or the crawl space, some of his military records and medals or whatever, and I found some little, like, 1.5-inch square pictures, and they were from concentration camps. They were bodies piled. And he got pretty upset when he saw me looking at them, because he was part that were liberating the concentration camps. I was fairly young, so he didn't want me looking at that stuff. It was a D-Day +3 at Omaha Beach. So not the initial wave, but still probably some pretty rough times, I'm sure.
Would you say that he, I guess, would be hit it remarkably well? Or because it seems like that generation, either they stuffed it way down or...
When I think about some of the stuff those guys went through, it's pretty incredible. And that's the difference. World War II, they were fighting for something. They were fighting for their country. And we were in Vietnam. We were fighting to get home. You're fighting for your buddy.
How would you describe yourself back then? You don't have to give yourself a psychiatric evaluation or anything, but how would you describe yourself back then, growing up?
Just, into sports, hanging out with your friends. Nothing unusual. Basically,
What were your plans? I mean, this is always funny. You ask someone who's young what their plans and ambitions were, but did you have like, oh, I'd like to be this?
I really didn't. Kind of like my plan is to get a couple more years of work and get my girls through college, but I didn't really think about, what I wanted to do. Although I made my daughter laugh a little while ago. She asked me what I wanted to be when I was really young, and I told her I wanted to be a cowboy, and that cracked her up. And I said she didn't realize the time, like when I was 10, 11, 12. I think I read somewhere there was 25 or 30 different westerns on television. So that's kind of what I was looking at. But as far as what a real job, I never really thought about it.
Even before we said, okay, Vietnam's here, there was a long Cold War that built up to that.
I do remember the duck and cover stuff, and I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis very well. And I wasn't sure what it was all about, but I remember going to bed and thinking about it, and it made me uneasy, at least. I wasn't sure of all the the ramifications, but I knew enough to know that this was maybe not a good time.
What did you notice as a kid? Were the adults acting kind of strange?
A little bit. I just remember maybe they wouldn't they'd be talking about it, and then if you came into the room, they might not talk about it. I remember watching it on TV, seeing it on TV. The Kennedy assassination, of course, I remember that. I remember on Sunday morning, my dad was watching TV, and I came in and turned the channel just as Lee Harvey Oswald got shot, and my dad going crazy, turn that back, and just again feeling uneasy.
When was the first time you heard about Vietnam?
The first time I heard about Vietnam or became aware of it was probably 1965 or 1966, watching all the footage on the news, Walter Cronkite. That's when I really became aware of the war, 65 or 66.
Did you ever imagine when they're first talking about it, did you ever imagine, oh, I'm going to be there?
No. I never thought that I was going to end up there. I didn't think that far ahead. When I was that age, I was basically just, the next party, who am I hanging out with?
What kind of information do you think was told to, the American people about Vietnam? And do you feel, knowing what you do now, that information was accurate or truthful? And if it wasn't, was that ignorance on the part of the government or willful deceit?
At that time, I think the government was willfully deceiving the American public about what was going on in Vietnam. A lot of it was based, supposedly when we got really involved, was something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And later, after I was out of the service, learned that it was total bullshit. It was made up. It never happened. The American government had the people believing that was why we were involved in Vietnam.
It seems like Vietnam, as with many wars, it started off initially with overwhelming public support. Why do you think that Vietnam had that kind of... Because it certainly didn't end with overwhelming support.
Because they were lied to. The public was lied to about all this stuff about communism and the domino effect and all these reasons that supposedly we were fighting for against communism or everything. And then when I got over there, find out that we were fighting for maybe Michelin tire or Domino sugar, being in the rubber plantations or the sugar plantations. Communism really had nothing to do with it that I could see.
The strange thing is, if that's what we were fighting for, we lost them anyway.
Right.
You were enlisted. You're not...
No, I was drafted.
You were drafted, okay.
So in a way, I did enlist. The first year of the lottery, they get you just like they do on TV now for the lottery. They had ping pong balls, and they went through every day of the year, and whatever number you got, that was when your draft status was going to be. They projected they were probably going to go to maybe the number 270, 275 the first year. My number was in the 120s. So I did volunteer for the draft.
When they did have this lottery system, was this something you watched live on television?
Oh, absolutely. We had a lottery viewing party with all the guys that were of draft age. I think I remember there was maybe 12, 15 guys there. There was some crying, there was some laughing if you got a high number or a low number.
How'd your family react to the news?
They were shocked when I volunteered, because actually my mom thought I was going to be going to junior college. She thought I had already enrolled. It was probably right before Christmas, and I remember my mom coming to my room and asked, "So what classes are you going to be taking?" And I told her, I said, "Well, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I'm not going to school. I'm going into the Army." And I could hear my father down the hall yelling, "What? What?" And he came on running into my room. He says, "What did you do?" And I said, "I volunteered for the draft." And then he says, "What, are you fucking nuts?" And just, he finally calmed down. I said, "I'm going to go anyway. I'm just going to get it over with." And so they were pretty upset, but then accepted it.
What were your initial orders? And
we took a bus from Kentucky there overnight, and I remember waking up the next morning, and we were just pulling into Fort Polk, and the first thing I saw was this big sign that said, "Welcome to Tigerland, birthplace of combat infantrymen for Vietnam." And I was kind of thinking, man, what did I get myself into here? And that was like, I think maybe 8 or another 10 weeks. And they gave me a 2-week leave, and I was supposed to report to go to Vietnam. And right about that same time, Randy was home on leave with orders to go to Vietnam. So we ended up going about the same time.
And did you know during basic training what capacity you'd be serving in?
No. In basic training, you're just getting adjusted to life in the military, following orders, being regimented, when you get up, when you go to sleep, when you eat, and all that kind of thing. And out of basic training, they say for every guy that's in the infantry, there's maybe 10 people behind the scenes that are doing other things to keep the guys on the front line. So out of about 100 guys in my basic training company, 10 of us got infantry training, and I was one of the 10.
Did you feel you were military material?
No, I was not a good soldier. By that point, I didn't believe in the war in Vietnam. I was basically in the Army because I knew I had to just get it out of the way.
What was the attitude of your fellow recruits?
Pretty much the same. I remember I guess it would have been in infantry training, the shootings at Kent State took place, where the National Guard opened fire on a student demonstration. I think there was 4 people killed. We were all kind of in shock at that. I knew at that point that I was enough against the war that I wasn't going to do anything that I felt was morally wrong.
Eventually you had to get on the plane and go to Vietnam. What was that plane ride like? What were you thinking?
It was actually a commercial airliner that left Fort Lewis, Washington, and stopped in Alaska, Japan, and finally Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam.
You get to that moment where it lands in Cam Ranh Bay, the doors actually open. What's the first thing that hit you?
Heat was how hot it was. And to back up a little bit, Randy and I were together in Fort Lewis, and as I mentioned, because I was over 30 days AWOL, I got what was called a summary court-martial. Basically, I had one stripe, they took it away and fined me. But Randy left a day before me. So when I got to Cam Ranh Bay, I knew that's where he had been going. But I mean, Cam Ranh Bay is a huge place. I didn't know how I was going to try to find Randy, but basically I had no idea where he was. And I'd been there a couple of days. I think it was like maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was outside having a cigarette and saw these guys waiting to get on a plane to move somewhere else in Vietnam, and there was Randy. And I just managed to talk to him long enough to find out where he was going. They were sending him to farther south in Vietnam to a base called Cu Chi. Well, as a result of being court-martialed, I was no longer able to hand carry my personnel record. And so then I learned that if you had a relative, a brother or stepbrother, whatever, in country, you could request to be stationed near them. So I went and told them that Randy was my stepbrother because there was no way they could check the records. And I said, I'd like to go where he went. And they, well, when did he get here? And I was like, last night. And they were all kind of crazy about that. What? How could you? I said, well, that's what happened. He got here last night. I got here today. So out of a lot of guys, most of them stayed in the northern part of South Vietnam. I got to go down to Cu Chi. And then when I arrived in Cu Chi, that's another huge base, maybe, I don't know how many, 20,000 guys. You go through something that's called Cherry School. It's like an indoctrination to get you used to what's going on in Vietnam. And I'd been there a few days, and all of a sudden, here comes Randy walking down the road with some other guys that actually he had met that knew Ralph. It's all kind of connected. And found out that he was going to be stationed at Cu Chi. So then I got assigned to a different company, and we got sent someplace else. Cu Chi was our main place, but I went out to a different fire base. And Randy and I communicated mostly with letters from my mother, to my mother. I would tell her, what's going on with me, and then Randy would write her, and then Mom would write me and him and tell him what the other guy was doing. So we were able to keep in touch with each other like that, and actually managed to get together a couple of times while we were over there. So that was a little odd.
Make it a little bit easier, though?
It did. I had malaria and was pretty sick, and when I got out of the hospital, I went back to Cu Chi, and my unit had moved. I didn't know at that time exactly where they were, so I went and found Randy, who was in a medical unit, and I stayed with him for, 4 or 5 days. And then I finally found out where my unit had gone to. And you basically went out to the airfield and found a helicopter or a plane that was going your way, and then they said, okay, get on. And when I finally got to where my unit was, they said, wait a minute, you got out of the hospital like a week ago. Where the hell you been? I said, well, I didn't know where you guys were, and just made up some kind of an excuse. And then I said, all right, let's move on. So again, I wasn't a real good soldier. I would do whatever I could to maybe circumvent the system.
What were your first impressions of the country itself?
Shocked by the poverty and the way the people were living. Couldn't, how hard that must have been.
Yeah, does it ever get you like, the amount of time you spent there was no doubt very tough and very difficult. You're thinking, like, man, we had to go there. They have to live there, and they have to stay there and live and die there. Is that ever like, how do people do that?
I don't think the Vietnamese people wanted us there either. I didn't trust them. They would steal anything they could, whether they could be Viet Cong. They may smile at you, but then that night they may be throwing mortars at you or something.
Let's talk about your actual duties. You work with the mortar platoon?
Yes.
How would you, go ahead and run us down a job description of what you had to do.
The designation was 11 Charlie, which meant mortars. 11 Bravo was regular infantry. The mortars, the thing, that was what I trained on in infantry training. We didn't actually use them a lot. They were fairly big and heavy. We didn't carry them with us in the field. If we had a fire base set up, we would set them up. But we did a lot of stuff just like in 11 Bravo, regular infantry, where we didn't take the mortars with us into the field. So it was basically just, a lot of patrols, just going around. Go back to mention the Cambodian thing. When I got there, the unit I was assigned to had just fairly recently returned from Cambodia. And I had heard a story that at first, as a company, they had refused to go. They wouldn't get on the helicopters that were going to take them. I don't know for how long, but they just said, no, we're not going. And I don't know what negotiations took place or whatever, but they eventually did go. So that was the unit I was assigned to, the guys that didn't necessarily want to look for trouble, but were experienced combat veterans and knew how to handle things. So they were a good bunch of guys to be with, to learn the ropes as to what to do or what not to do.
If you weren't able to bring mortars into the field, but you were still with the front line, what were you at M16, or what did they give you?
In M16. When you have a fire base, there'd be, sandbags or whatever built up, and if you'd come, most of the time we'd return to that most every night.
I imagine there's something of a misconception when it comes to what let's just say if you're doing mortars that day. In one way, some people might say, well, you're not on the front lines, it might be safer. But on the other hand, it's like, well, no, that's the first thing the enemy wants to take out is the artillery, right? It's a dangerous job.
It could be. Probably the biggest things we faced were other Vietnamese or Viet Cong mortar attacks. There was always the threat of being attacked by a large force. Fortunately for me, that never happened. Overall, I actually had it pretty good over there. I didn't run into a lot of trouble.
Well, I mean, again, adding to the job description, you're also handling explosives. It's dangerous by design. Could you talk about the stress of like, ooh, it's like Bugs Bunny, you hit this and...
Well, actually, there was a time where we had a mission. Another platoon had been out, and they did run into some trouble, so we were trying to give them support with the mortars. And you've got your mortar tube, and you take the mortar shell and you drop it down in the tube. And then it hits a firing pin and basically pops it back, shoots it back out. Well, we were trying to get off as many rounds as possible, so we were doing it on both sides. I would put one in, that one would come out, and the guy on the other side would put one in. Well, the guy on the other side had his over the tube before the one I had put in got all the way out. And there's like a charge around the base of the mortar shell that when the one shell hit that one and it set that charge off and hit this guy who happened to be black with little bits of gunpowder all over his chest. He wasn't seriously hurt. And the mortar didn't explode because they have to travel a certain amount of distance before they're armed. It went about 75 yards and then just nothing. It didn't explode. It got outside our perimeter, but it didn't explode. And it knocked the one he had out of his hand. But again, it didn't explode. It just set off the primary charge, and He wasn't seriously hurt. And as I mentioned, he was black. He ended up having a bunch of pink dots all over his chest, which at the time we thought was kind of funny.
But to be more, like for 1 second, what was your...
1 second, my heart stopped. I thought we were going to be blown up.
How fast do you think you had to recollect yourself?
10 or 15 seconds when we realized he wasn't seriously hurt, and, drop another round in and stop trying to make it so fast. But for, like I said, a brief second, I thought, we were dead, and then just get back into it, and then shortly after that, the whole mission was called off.
And this guy got back on his feet?
Oh, he was fine.
The idea that, like, oh my God, I almost got blown to, and then you just keep going, that seems like a crazy place to get to.
It was a crazy place to be.
There's a certain distance between you and the target.
Right.
But that being said, it's not a ton of distance. It's nothing like what we have now where it's a drone strike. There's a certain proximity. You're aware of what happens on the receiving end. Is this something that weighed heavily on you guys at any time?
Not me personally. I did see the results a couple of times, but not a lot. And one of the things that kind of got me about they would in the Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper, they would publish body counts or kills for the week of different units. And a lot of it, if you fired so many rounds out of a mortar or a cannon or whatever it was, I don't remember what the ratio was, but for every so many rounds, they would count so many bodies, whether they were there or not. And then publish these, like, all right, this is how many we killed this week. We killed 300 Vietnamese, Viet Cong. We didn't lose anybody. It was like keeping score, but it was all crap.
And this bothered you?
It bothered me to the point where, I knew the whole, by that point, I knew the whole war was bullshit. And it was just another added thing to it of how they were all lying. And wasn't anything I could do about it.
You talked about malaria. That's another part of war that I don't think people who haven't been there might not think about. War disrupts so many things, supply and everything. There could be starvation, famine, illness. How big of a problem was malaria and all these other problems? What was it doing? When
I first got over there, I heard that if you had malaria 3 times, they'd send you home. So I checked around. I asked some medics that I said, how bad is it when you get malaria? Does anybody die from malaria? And they said, no, hardly anybody. Maybe 1 in 100. So I thought that was better odds than getting shot at. So I didn't take the malaria pills, the prevention pills. And then I ended up getting malaria, and it almost killed me. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks. I had 105.8 temperature for a while. So, and then, I said, all right, maybe that wasn't such a smart thing to do. I ended up getting it 2 more times, and they didn't send me home. So.
Just one more lie.
Yeah, again, yeah.
I understand there was a story involving bees.
Absolutely. Being attacked by bees was the scariest I ever was in Vietnam. Whether being shot at, which I said was infrequent or whatever. We were out doing what they call a perimeter sweep. We were at a fire base, and every evening, maybe around 5 or 6 o'clock, 8, 10, 12 guys would go out and just do a sweep around the perimeter, maybe 100 yards out, make sure there was nobody waiting for you. So there was another guy walking point. He was maybe 20 yards ahead of me. I was second, and then there was a guy with the radio behind me. And the guy walking point stopped, so I stopped. And I looked over to my left, and maybe 10 yards away looked like 4-foot square beehive, honeycomb. It was flat. And I saw that, and I just froze. One bee came out, circled my head, went back and told the other bees, and then the whole hive just swarmed all around my head and shoulders. The guy that was walking point had come back. They got on him, and then the guy with the radio was close to me. They got on him, too. We all took off in different directions, running. I dropped my weapon. The guy with the radio dropped the radio. I ran, and I don't know, you just couldn't get away from him. I remember a banana tree has like these huge leaves, and I tried to get inside the leaves as some protection, and that helped for a little bit. But then they got in there. They were just all over my face and head. And then I ran some more, and then finally I was so exhausted, I just said, I can't run anymore. If they're going to kill me, that's it. And I just went down, face down in the dirt. And when I did that, they finally stopped stinging me. So then a medic came by, and they were giving me some, I think, Benadryl or something. They called in a helicopter to get us out. And we had all ran in different directions. The two guys, the radio guy and the guy walking point, were in one spot, and I was in another spot. And they wanted me to go to where the other two guys were. And to do that, I would have had to go back by the beehive. And I said, I'm not doing that. And I could see there was a clearing close to where I was big enough for a helicopter to land. I said, tell the guy he can land twice. I guess we were about a quarter of a mile apart. So they did finally land twice. I ended up being in the hospital for like 3 days. I was told they stopped counting after 100 stingers out of my face and neck and head. And went back to the unit after that.
Ultimately, life is very fragile. I imagine that point gets driven home in a war zone.
Yeah. Like I said, I was pretty lucky as far as being in combat situations. I never saw anybody in my unit get wounded or killed. Did see a few Viet Cong bodies. And I remember at the time thinking that they didn't look real. They looked like mannequins or something. And I really didn't have any emotion about it. I was glad it was them and not me.
Randy this is something I never really thought about with the war. Randy showed me some of the articles from Stars and Stripes and the other publications where I always thought war is, it's bullets, it's bombs, might be disease and things like that. What really surprised me was that drugs were used as a weapon by the Viet Cong or the NVA, whoever was supplying it, in several ways.
Absolutely.
Could you comment on that?
Well, when I first got over there, marijuana was really prevalent, and there was kind of two groups. They were called the juicers and the heads, the alcohol or the marijuana, or then there was, an overlap. And all of a sudden, I got there in July, maybe toward November or so, or somewhere around that time. All of a sudden, a friend of mine came up to me and said he had some cocaine. I'd never done cocaine, but I said, well, okay, I'll give it a try. And after snorting, a few grains of this stuff, I ended up throwing up. And I could, even though I hadn't done cocaine, I knew enough about it to know that what I was experiencing was not cocaine. And it turned out to be heroin. And then all of a sudden, it was everywhere, the heroin. Just seemed like it was I don't know where it was coming from, but you could just, Vietnamese guys, they're going around in a village or something, you'd buy these little vials. And it was just everywhere. And it got to be more prevalent because with the marijuana, you always had to go off somewhere, try to get somewhere where they couldn't smell the marijuana. You could smoke the heroin. You could unroll a cigarette halfway. You could literally count the grains and put it in the cigarette, twist it up, and you could stand there smoking it, talking to an officer, and he wouldn't know until he saw you maybe start to nod out or something. But again, it was just everywhere. And I'm sure their idea was to get everybody using it as much as they could. This would be like the end of 1970, early 71. So it was not everybody did it, but enough, a lot.
It really does take it back to the determination of, if I may call them, the enemy, because anything to take you out of commission, if they can't take you out literally. Oh, yeah. Well,
they were just tougher than we were. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. They fought the French. Some of the things, living in tunnels, they wanted it way more. I mean, especially by the time in the 70s, I could care less whether the North Vietnamese took over the country or not. And I got that feeling from a lot of the people as well. A lot of the stuff we were doing at that time it was called Vietnamization. We were supposedly working with the South Vietnamese army to train them better and get them to take over the fighting, because they were starting to pull troops out at that time. The United States was. And our work with the ARVNs, as they're called, the South Vietnamese Army, we'd be with them in one area for a while, and then we'd leave and turn it over to the ARVNs. A month later, we'd have to go back because they couldn't hold it. My experience with the ARVNs was that they didn't care what was going on. I mean, Sometimes, we were watching our backs for them as much as we were for the Viet Cong.
Do you feel that that was adequately ever understood?
Oh, it was pretty widely known for a long time that the president of South Vietnam, I think even going back to as far as Kennedy, that they were corrupt and couldn't be trusted.
The end would have come sooner had the American people understood that.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, Nixon, when they I guess 75, when we did finally pull out, the terms that they finally settled on could have been done 5-6 years earlier. They basically settled for the same thing that was on the table 5 or 6 years before. Nixon used it to get reelected.
You cannot be wrong ever in politics. And do you think that that's something that needs to change?
I'm not real high on the American people's intelligence as a whole. Some of the things that go on, I shake my head. How could Laverne and Shirley have been the #1 TV show for so many years? So.
Well, it seems like there was some pretty long-term damage control with the military after Vietnam. Nobody wanted to enlist. There was extreme distrust. No one would sign up. Has our reputation ever recovered from Vietnam?
I think most people realize now it was a mistake. You see the military today, all volunteer. I think people just look back on it as just saying it was a mistake and they want to get past it and forget about it.
But there's no learning from it.
Well, I don't know. We're still, sending guys out to causes that are questionable. Look at the first Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction that were I remember when Colin Powell gave his speech about sending troops in. I was totally behind it. And then find out later that he was duped and had been lied to. So it doesn't end, I guess.
Well, who lied to him? Because
the Bush administration, the first one.
But is it his job? Colin Powell, Westmoreland, Robert McNamara. Is this the way that this is supposed to work? The president tells you what the situation is? You're the military. It's your job to get the intelligence and brief the president, isn't it?
Well, again, you have people with their own agendas and in the military or whatever that maybe, they're not giving the president the right information. Or the president has the information and moves ahead in how he chooses anyway. So as far as that goes, I don't think much has changed.
Do you feel a personal sense of frustration with, they fooled me again? How could they fool me? Because I
did a little bit at that time, but now I'm more, I try to take care of my block, and I got 2 kids in college, and all this other stuff. I actually can't be bothered with it anymore.
Is it safe to say that, though, you probably won't be fooled again?
Who knows? I might be. You don't know what information is true out there.
Well, when did you find out you'd be leaving Vietnam?
It actually came kind of sudden because we were supposed to be there for a year. We'd been there 9 months, and I think it was like within 2 weeks we were on our way home. Didn't quite believe it. Again, interesting or some kind of a story with because Randy and I said we'd communicate through letters to my mother, and then found out I was going home in a couple of weeks. I didn't know what his situation was, and I was at Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base outside Saigon getting ready to go home, and they were lining up to get on a plane, and there comes Randy getting on the plane. He had gotten the same time to go home. I almost got on the same plane, but that filled up. I had to wait till the next morning. But it was pretty sudden, and I remember how quiet you could hear a pin drop before that plane took off. Everybody's going down the runway. You still got a shot. Somebody a rocket propelled grenade or something, could hit the airplane. And it wasn't until that, you got maybe a minute into the air that there was just this huge roar that it's actually true. We're out of here and we're going home.
How you came to come home. I understand that Randy was involved in that too. Can you tell us that?
Okay, so I knew Randy was on the plane ahead of me, and he got out of the Army when he got back. He was done. I don't know if he did that in California or what. My plane coming back landed in Seattle, Washington, but I couldn't get a commercial flight from there to Chicago. They wouldn't let it. I had to fly to Philadelphia and then go through processing at Fort Dix and then fly from Philadelphia back to Chicago. So when I landed at O'Hare, I called Randy's house, and his dad told me that he had just left. He was at my house. So I said, oh, all right, I guess the surprise is blown. So I called my house, and Randy answered the phone. I said, don't say anything. It's me. I'm at O'Hare. Come get me. And so he said, okay, and he gave my mother some kind of excuse, and he came out to O'Hare and got me. And I walked in the house. I remember my mother coming up the stairs. She had a basket of laundry and dropping the laundry in just total shock. It was pretty emotional. My mom was crying. And then my father coming in, and I remember him dropping his briefcase, and just total surprise, and grabbing a bottle of scotch so we could all have a cocktail. My little brother coming home from school, and then he got to stay home the rest of the day because it was middle of the day. It was kind of hard to believe that we were actually home.
Can you talk about an emotion that you might have had when everything that was a struggle wasn't a struggle? You open the fridge and there's the food. You turn on a light switch and there. Did you ever think the same way about such things again?
So you just appreciate things more, for sure. It's a little off the track, but I love ice water. And I remember a time in Vietnam when we'd been out of water, like the previous day, and that next day we were going to meet a supply helicopter down some dirty, dusty road, and some armored personnel carriers were going by, and these guys had ice water. They had a huge chunk of ice, and I don't know where they got it, but they had some ice water. And I remember them giving us a drink, and how good that ice water tasted. I can remember that. And every time I have a good cold glass of water now when I'm thirsty, it takes me right back to that day.
You must have been a different person coming home. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah. The thing is, the whole time I was there, it was like I was somebody else. Actually, I was Steve McQueen. He was my hero growing up, and I'd be walking down a trail or in the jungle or a road or whatever, and some kind of, I can't believe I'm doing this. There could be somebody out there getting ready to take a shot at me. I might have to shoot back. This is crazy. And then I would think to myself, how would Steve McQueen act? And I think of him in some movie or something, and then I would do that. So the whole time I was over there, it was like it was somebody else was doing it. It wasn't really me. And then when I came back, I just went back to being whatever I was before.
Do you ultimately think that Vietnam, in some ways, was good for you? Do you think you took away a certain knowledge, a certain understanding, a certain appreciation you didn't have before?
I think it certainly made me grow up. I mean, I was in and out of the Army before I was 21, so I had a different perspective on things. And in the end, it ended up, I had 5 years in college because of it. It turned out okay.
When I decided to make this, my mom, who was a public school teacher, I think at the time she was teaching middle school kids, and they were talking about this and that, and realized that one of the kids' parents was your guy's age, and said, "Oh, did he serve in Vietnam?" And the kid went, "What's Vietnam?" How does that make you feel? I mean,
there's adults that don't know what Vietnam is. Again, I don't really care, except for the part that, the history, if you don't learn from it, you'll repeat it. So there's that aspect. And I think I've mentioned to Randy that we're as far removed from Vietnam as our parents were from World War II at this point. So, the longer the time goes, the less it seems to matter.
But it does matter. I mean, that was a huge thing, the idea that nothing is learned from it.
But it's just a human nature. I think we tend to forget things the farther they go behind us. A mistake not to learn from it, but I just think it's just human nature.
What would you like to say about hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans? What would you like to say about them? What would you like people to understand about them? Because I think they've been very misunderstood.
A lot of, we have, I guess. Sometimes I look at today's guys coming back from war, and wished that we'd have had that kind of respect and treatment. Then I saw something the other day that one way to look at it is we did get more people aware of Vietnam, and maybe getting the veterans more respect because we were treated either without at all or badly treated, that it's the reason that their veterans seem to be taken care of better, well, maybe not taken care of better, but at least respected more, and people are more aware of them because of the mistakes in the way they treated Vietnam veterans. So in that way, maybe, something good's come of it.